When I first met Brian, I thought I had found someone who truly understood me. He was charming, supportive, and most importantly, he respected my ambitions. I had always been career-driven, and I made no apologies for it. I worked my way up in marketing, fighting for every promotion and proving myself in a male-dominated field. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the passion, the sense of achievement, the thrill of landing a major client or launching a successful campaign. By the time I turned 34, I had finally secured the promotion I had been working toward for years. I became a senior marketing director at a prestigious firm, a role that came with a bigger office, a bigger paycheck, and, of course, bigger responsibilities. It felt like everything had fallen into place. Brian and I had been married for 6 years at that point, and we had talked about having children someday. But it always seemed like something we would get to when the timing was right. Then I got pregnant. I won't lie, I was terrified. My career was at its peak, and I had no idea how I was going to balance it with a baby. But Brian was supportive, at least at first. He assured me we would figure it out together, that we could be equals in both parenting and work. When Sophie was born, my world shifted. Nothing could have prepared me for the overwhelming love I felt the first time I held her in my arms. But it was also exhausting. The sleepless nights, the crying, the constant feeding, it was like nothing I had ever experienced. I was on maternity leave for 6 months, and during that time, I started to notice subtle changes in Brian. At first, it was small things, comments here and there about how wonderful it was to have me home, how lucky Sophie was to have a full-time mom, how fast babies grow and how I wouldn't want to miss a single moment. I brushed it off. Maybe he was just adjusting to the changes, like I was. But then the hints became stronger. One night, when Sophie was about 4 months old, Brian and I were having dinner, and he casually said, "You know, we don't really need the extra income. My salary is more than enough for us to live comfortably." I paused, mid-bite. "What are you saying?" "I just think, maybe it would be better for everyone if you stayed home with Sophie. At least for a few more years. She needs her mother." I swallowed my frustration and forced a smile. "Brian, I love our daughter more than anything, but I also love my job. We talked about this before she was born. You said you supported me working." He sighed, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "That was before I saw how hard it is for you. You're exhausted all the time. You're barely sleeping. Do you really think you can juggle all of this?" I clenched my jaw. Millions of women do it every day. And millions of women regret missing out on their kids' childhoods because they were too focused on work. That was the first real fight we had about it, but it wouldn't be the last. When my maternity leave was nearing its end, I started making preparations to go back. I arranged for a nanny, adjusted my schedule to make sure I could spend as much time with Sophie as possible, and even spoke to my boss about potentially working from home part-time. But every time I brought it up to Brian, he seemed more and more distant. One evening, after putting Sophie to sleep, I walked into the living room and found Brian sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a tense expression. "Hey," I said, sitting beside him. "Everything okay?" He didn't look up. "I was just reading something. Did you know that children who are raised by stay-at-home moms tend to do better emotionally?" I sighed. "Brian, just listen, Amanda. I've been thinking about this a lot. I don't want Sophie to grow up feeling neglected. She needs stability, routine. She needs you. She needs both of us. She has me. I'll always be here." That statement hit me harder than I expected. "What are you saying? That I wouldn't be here for her?" He finally looked at me, and his face was full of something I couldn't quite place. Was it disappointment? Pity? "I just think that if you go back to work, you'll regret it." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "And if I don't go back to work? What then?" He hesitated. "Then you'll be doing what's best for our daughter." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was not the man I had married, the man who had once encouraged me to chase my dreams. It was like he had transformed overnight into someone who saw me as nothing more than a mother, as if my only purpose was to take care of Sophie. Over the next few weeks, the tension between us only grew. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same thing. His belief that I should stay home, my insistence that I could be both a great mother and a dedicated professional. He stopped being affectionate, barely even kissed me goodbye in the mornings. And worst of all, he started making decisions without me. One afternoon, I came home from a quick errand to find Brian sitting in the kitchen with his mother Ellen. My stomach sank immediately. Ellen was the kind of woman who believed a woman's place was in the home, and I had always known she disapproved of my career-driven nature. I barely had time to say hello before she launched into her speech. "Amanda, dear, Brian tells me you're still planning to go back to work." I shot Brian a glare, but he just sipped his coffee, avoiding my gaze. "Yes, I am," I said firmly. She sighed dramatically, as if I had just told her I planned to abandon my child. "I just worry about little Sophie. A nanny can never replace a mother." I clenched my fists. "Ellen, I appreciate your concern, but this is my decision." Brian finally spoke. "I just thought it would be good for you to hear another perspective." My blood boiled. "Brian, can I talk to you in private?" He followed me into the bedroom, and the moment the door shut, I turned on him. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know why you're so upset," he said, crossing his arms. "She's just looking out for Sophie's best interests." I shook my head in disbelief. "No, Brian. She's trying to manipulate me into quitting my job. And you let her." For the first time, I saw something cold in his eyes. Maybe because she's right. That was the moment I realized I was in a battle I never signed up for. The man who had once promised to be my partner was now pushing me into a corner, trying to force me into a role I never agreed to. And the worst part? I had no idea how far he was willing to go to get his way. When Brian and I first started our life together, I believed we were equals. We had the same goals, the same understanding of what our marriage would be, a partnership where we both supported each other. But after Sophie was born, it felt like I was suddenly being pushed into a role I never agreed to. At first, it was just comments. Little remarks here and there about how lucky I was to have this time with Sophie, how nice it would be if I didn't have to go back to work. But then Brian started bringing it up more often, and each time he was a little more forceful. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table, Sophie asleep in her crib. I had barely taken a bite before Brian started again. I was thinking, he said, setting down his fork. What if we moved? I frowned. Moved where? To a smaller town. Somewhere quieter, cheaper. A place where we don't have to worry about daycare costs, or a nanny, or all the stress that comes with living in the city. I stared at him stunned. Brian, my job is here. He shrugged. You could work remotely. Or, he hesitated for just a second. You could take a break, just for a while. Focus on Sophie while she's still little. I put my fork down. Brian, no. I've worked too hard to throw my career away. He sighed, rubbing his temples like I was the one being difficult. Amanda, I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. We don't need the money. We don't need the stress. Why are you so obsessed with working? Because it's part of who I am. I snapped. You knew that when you married me. He looked away, his jaw tightening. That was the first time I saw it. The crack in his patience, the resentment simmering just below the surface. But I didn't realize just how far he would take it. A week later, I came home from work to find Brian's parents sitting in my living room. Ellen and Richard had always been traditional, but they had tolerated me, at least until Sophie was born. Now, it felt like they had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to pounce. Amanda, Ellen began, smiling in that condescending way that made my skin crawl. Brian tells us you're still planning to work full-time. I shot Brian a sharp look. That's right. Richard, who rarely spoke much, let out a disapproving hum. We just don't understand why. Because I love my job, I said, my voice even. Because I worked hard for it. Ellen sighed dramatically. But what about Sophie? A child needs her mother in these early years. Don't you want to be there for her first words? Her first steps. My hands clenched into fists. I can be there for all of that and still have a career. Richard leaned forward, his eyes sharp. That's what you think. But I've seen it before, mothers who choose their jobs over their families. It never ends well. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Are you threatening me? Ellen gasped. Of course not. We're just concerned, dear. But Brian wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at his hands, silent. And that silence was worse than anything his parents could have said. That night, when they finally left, I turned to him. What the hell was that? He had the audacity to look surprised. They're just worried about you. No, Brian. They're trying to manipulate me, and you're letting them. He crossed his arms. Maybe because they're right. I stared at him, my stomach twisting. I can't believe this. I thought you supported me. I do. He sighed. I think you're making a mistake. I took a shaky breath. Brian, if you keep pushing me, you're going to lose me. His face darkened. So you'd pick your job over your family? I shook my head. I shouldn't have to choose. But it was clear he saw things differently. The next month was hell. Every conversation circled back to the same argument. Brian became colder, more distant. He started making passive-aggressive remarks about neglectful mothers whenever he saw a news story about a career woman getting a divorce. He would forget to tell me about Sophie's doctor appointments, claiming he didn't think I'd be able to make time for them. Then, one evening, he dropped the bombshell. I can't do this anymore. I looked up from the laptop where I was answering emails. Do what? This marriage. This life where I feel like I'm the only one who cares about our family. I felt my stomach drop. Brian, what are you saying? I'm saying, he took a deep breath, that if you don't cut back your hours, at least go part-time, then I don't know if we can stay together. I stared at him, unable to breathe. You're giving me an ultimatum? He didn't flinch. Yes. I wanted to scream. To throw something. But instead, I just nodded slowly. Okay, I said. Then I guess I have a decision to make. And that's when I knew I needed a lawyer. The next day, I called a friend of mine, Leah, who had gone through a nasty divorce a few years back. She gave me the number of her attorney, Julia Brennan. Julia was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. When I sat down in her office, she listened carefully as I explained everything. Brian's pressure, his parents' interference, the ultimatum. When I finished, she tapped her pen against the desk. Do you think he'll try to take Sophie? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. What? If he's this determined to control your decisions, there's a chance he'll fight for full custody if you don't comply. I swallowed hard. He wouldn't. Julia raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? I thought about the way he had been acting lately. The way he talked about Sophie as if she was more his than mine. The way his parents looked at me like I was some sort of threat. No, I whispered. I'm not sure. Julia nodded. Then we need to prepare. She laid out everything. What I needed to document. What I needed to protect myself legally. And for the first time, I realized just how dangerous this situation had become. I wasn't just fighting for my career anymore. I was fighting for my daughter. Brian and I had been at war for months. The constant arguments about my job, his insistence that I should stay home, the pressure from his parents, it had all pushed me to a breaking point. And then, out of nowhere, he proposed a compromise. I'll take paternity leave, he said one night, his voice unusually calm. If you're really so determined to keep working, I'll stay home with Sophie. I almost didn't believe him. You will. I will, he nodded, as if it was the most logical thing in the world. You've got this big promotion opportunity, right? If I take leave, you can focus on your job without worrying about childcare. I didn't trust it, not at first. Brian had been so adamant that I should be the one to stay home. Why was he suddenly willing to do it himself? But I also knew that if I refused, he'd use it against me. He'd say I didn't want a real compromise, that I was putting my career above our family. So I agreed. For the first week, Brian was cocky. He strutted around like some kind of super dad, telling me how easy it was to care for Sophie. She's such a good baby, he'd say with a smirk. I don't know why you were always so exhausted. I clenched my jaw but didn't argue. I knew reality would hit him soon enough. And sure enough, by the end of the second week, the cracks began to show. One night, I came home to find the living room in complete chaos. Toys scattered everywhere. A half-eaten bowl of cereal on the coffee table. Sophie wailing in her playpen while Brian sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television, dark circles under his eyes. Rough day? I asked, setting down my bag. He turned to me, looking like he hadn't slept in years. She wouldn't nap. She threw her food on the floor. Then she had a meltdown because I gave her the wrong stuffed animal. I bit back a smile. Sounds exhausting. He groaned, rubbing his temples. She cried for 2 hours straight. I couldn't even go to the bathroom without her screaming like I was abandoning her. I crossed my arms. Kind of like what I went through every day on maternity leave. He glared at me but didn't respond. I thought maybe, just maybe, this experience would make him more understanding. That he'd finally see how hard it was and stop acting like my career was some kind of selfish choice. But Brian never admitted when he was wrong. Instead of acknowledging the struggle, he twisted it into something else entirely. She's really attached to me, he started saying over and over. She cries when I leave the room, but not when you do. She reaches for me first. I think she sees me as the primary parent. At first, I thought he was just being insecure. That he needed some validation. That's because you're with her all day, I reassured him. It's natural. But as the weeks went on, his comments became sharper. Maybe she just prefers me. She only falls asleep when I rock her. She doesn't even notice when you leave in the morning. It was subtle, the way he said it. Never outright cruel, never direct enough for me to call him out. But the implication was always there. Sophie loves me more than she loves you. And the worst part? I started to believe it. One night, I got home late from a work event. It had been a long, exhausting day, and all I wanted was to hold my daughter. When I walked into Sophie's room, Brian was already there, rocking her in the chair. Her little body was curled against his chest, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. She's asleep, he whispered. I just want to see her for a second. I stepped closer, but Brian shook his head. If you wake her up, she's going to cry for hours. I hesitated. Brian, she's my daughter too. He sighed, like I was being unreasonable. Amanda, she's finally settled. Do you really want to ruin that just so you can feel better? Something about the way he said it, the condescension, the quiet accusation, made my chest tighten. I'll be careful, I insisted, reaching out for her. Brian stood up, stepping back. Seriously, Amanda. Don't. I froze. Go get some rest, he said, his voice softer now, like he was doing me a favor. She'll see you in the morning. I swallowed the lump in my throat and walked out. But that night, I couldn't sleep. As time passed, Brian's behavior got worse. If Sophie cried while I was holding her, he'd swoop in with a smug. Here, let me take her, like I was doing something wrong. If I fed her, he'd correct me. She doesn't like it like that, even though I'd been feeding her just fine for months before he ever took leave. One morning, I found him sitting with his mother, Ellen, whispering in hushed voices. When I walked in, they went silent. I crossed my arms. What's going on? Ellen smiled sweetly. Brian was just telling me how attached Sophie is to him. I shot Brian a sharp look. He just shrugged. She cries every time I leave the room, he said casually. I think she feels safer with me. I forced a laugh. Or maybe it's because you never let me have time with her. Ellen said. Oh, Amanda. Babies know where they belong. I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palms. This wasn't just about Brian anymore. His mother, his whole family, was in on it. They wanted to push me out. And I had no idea how far they were willing to go. It all came to a head one evening. I was sitting on the couch, trying to coax Sophie into my lap. But she was fussy. Nothing unusual. Babies had moods. But Brian was watching with that smug, knowing look. She doesn't want to sit with you, he said. She's just tired, I muttered. He smirked. Or maybe she's more comfortable with me. Something inside me snapped. You need to stop, I said, standing up. Stop acting like you're the only parent that matters. Stop making me feel like I'm failing my own daughter. Brian raised an eyebrow. I'm not making you feel anything, Amanda. I took a deep breath. This ends now. Either we go back to being partners, or we have a real problem. He tilted his head, considering me. Then he leaned back, arms crossed. I think you're the one with the problem. My hands shook. What the hell does that mean? He just smiled. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just some petty competition to him. He wanted control. Over Sophie. Over me. Over everything. And if I didn't do something soon, I was going to lose more than just my career. I was going to lose my daughter. The moment I realized my marriage was falling apart wasn't during one of our screaming matches. It wasn't even in the cold silences that had started to stretch between us. It was something smaller, quieter. A Tuesday evening when Brian and I stood in the kitchen, side by side, washing dishes after dinner. I handed him a plate to dry. He took it without a word. We hadn't spoken to each other in hours. And the worst part? It felt normal. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was what we had become. Two people living in the same house, raising the same child, but barely existing in the same life. And suddenly, I couldn't remember the last time we had laughed together. The last time he had looked at me like he loved me, instead of like I was some kind of adversary. I swallowed hard, setting the sponge down in the sink. Brian. He didn't even glance at me. What? I hesitated. What was I even going to say? That I missed him? That I missed us? That I was drowning in this unspoken tension, suffocating under the weight of everything we refused to say out loud? Instead, I heard myself ask, "Did you take the trash out?" He nodded. Yeah. And that was the extent of our conversation for the night. That was when I knew. I didn't bring up divorce right away. It sat in the back of my mind, a quiet, lingering thought that I wasn't ready to say out loud. But once it was there, I couldn't unthink it. Every argument, every forced interaction, every time he sighed in frustration when I walked into the room, it all piled up until I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. I began to imagine a life without him. What it would be like to wake up in a house where I didn't feel constantly judged. To come home and not have to brace myself for whatever passive-aggressive comment he had saved up for the day. To raise Sophie in a space that wasn't filled with this suffocating tension. And the more I thought about it, the more possible it started to seem. One night, after another tense dinner where we barely spoke, I did something I never thought I would do. I opened my laptop and searched how to prepare for divorce. The articles were endless. Legal advice, financial checklists, custody considerations. My stomach twisted as I read through them. Was I really ready for this? Could I really walk away from the man I had built my life with? A part of me still wanted to believe we could fix this. That we could find our way back to each other. But another part, when I was starting to listen to more and more, knew that might not be possible. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. Sophie had been fussy all day, teething and cranky, refusing to nap. I had spent hours trying to soothe her while Brian locked himself in his office, claiming he had work to do. Finally, after pacing the house with Sophie in my arms for what felt like an eternity, I knocked on his door. "Brian," I called. "I need help." Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. "Brian." The door swung open, and he glared at me. "What?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "She won't settle down. I just need you to take her for a bit so I can breathe." He sighed dramatically, running a hand through his hair. "Amanda, I told you, I have work." I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh really? Work? Like the work I had to come home to after spending all day at the office, just to take over everything while you sat on your ass." His eyes darkened. "You're overreacting." "No, Brian," I snapped. "I'm exhausted. I'm doing everything alone, and you don't even care." His jaw clenched. "That's not true." I shook my head. "It is true. And I'm done pretending this is okay." There it was. The words were out now, hanging between us like a bomb waiting to explode. His face twisted in something unreadable, anger, fear, maybe even regret. "What are you saying?" I swallowed. "I don't think this is working anymore." His expression didn't change. "So that's it? You're just giving up." "I'm not the only one who checked out, Brian," I whispered. "We both have." For a second, he didn't respond. Just stared at me like he was trying to see if I was bluffing. Then finally, he stepped back. "Do whatever you want," he muttered, turning away. And just like that, the conversation was over. After that, things got even worse. We barely spoke. When we did, it was about the logistics of raising Sophie, who was picking her up from daycare, who was handling dinner. There was no affection, no connection. Just two people playing house, pretending like we hadn't already checked out. Then one night, Brian came home late. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when he walked in. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled like he had been sitting in a bar for hours. I didn't even ask where he had been. I didn't care. But then he sat down next to me, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Amanda," he said, his voice softer than it had been in months. I looked at him wary. "What?" He took a deep breath. "I don't want to lose you." For the first time in a long time, I saw something real in his eyes. Not arrogance. Not anger. Just fear. I swallowed. "Brian. I know I've been an asshole," he cut me off. "I know I've been pushing you away. And I know I've made you feel like you're not enough." I clenched my jaw, fighting the sting behind my eyes. "Yeah, you have." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how we got here. When Sophie was born, everything changed. I got scared. Scared that I wasn't good enough. That I was failing as a father. That you would wake up one day and realize you didn't need me." I stared at him. "So instead of talking to me, you tried to control me?" He nodded, his face tight with shame. "I thought if I could make you stay home, if I could make you rely on me, you wouldn't leave." I let out a shaky breath. "That's not love, Brian. That's fear." He looked down. "I know." For the first time in months, we sat in silence, Not the cold, empty kind, but something softer. Something that felt a little bit like understanding. Then he looked up at me. Would you go to therapy with me? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no. To walk away and never look back. But another part, the part that remembered the man I had fallen in love with, wasn't ready to let go just yet. I took a deep breath. Okay. And just like that, for the first time in a long time, we had something that almost felt like hope. When I left our house with nothing but a suitcase and the weight of months of unresolved arguments on my shoulders, I told myself that it wasn't permanent, that this was just a break, a chance to clear my head and figure out what came next. But as I drove away from the life I had built with Brian, watching the house grow smaller in my rearview mirror, I wasn't sure if I believed that anymore. The separation hadn't been explosive. There had been no screaming, no dramatic ultimatums thrown across the room. Instead, it had been a slow unraveling, a gradual collapse under the weight of resentment and exhaustion, an unspoken agreement that we simply didn't know how to be in the same space without hurting each other anymore. I had fought so hard to hold on, to fix what was broken, but in the end, stepping away had felt like the only option left. I found refuge in a small, sparsely furnished apartment downtown, owned by my coworker Lila, who had recently moved in with her boyfriend and hadn't yet decided what to do with the place. It was small, just a studio with a mattress on the floor and a kitchenette that barely fit 2 people, but it was quiet, and it was mine. Brian and I barely spoke, except for short, clipped conversations about Sophie, her daycare schedule, doctor's appointments, the logistics of pickups and drop-offs. Every interaction felt clinical, like business partners arranging a schedule rather than 2 people who had once promised to spend their lives together. I thought maybe the silence would help, that time apart would give us some clarity, but instead, it only made me realize how long we had already been living like this, 2 strangers coexisting under the same roof. And for the first time, I began to seriously consider if this was the beginning of the end. I didn't tell Brian that I was thinking about divorce, not yet, but the thought had taken root in my mind, and I knew I had to be prepared. I had met with my lawyer Julia a few months ago when things had started to spiral, and she had been blunt with me. If you're even considering divorce, you need to get your finances in order, she had said. No surprises, no loose ends. Know exactly where you stand before you make any decisions. So I started making lists, going through bank statements, documenting everything that I might need if this turned into something more permanent. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold, but I knew I had to be ready for whatever came next. Then, one evening Brian called me. His voice was tense, but not angry, just tired. I need to see you, he said, and when I immediately asked if Sophie was okay, his response was quiet. She's fine. I need to talk. I hesitated, gripping my phone tightly. I could have said no. I could have told him that whatever he needed to say could be handled over the phone, that I wasn't ready to sit across from him and pretend we were still the people we used to be. But there was something in his voice that stopped me. Okay, I said finally. We met at a small diner halfway between my apartment and the house, a quiet place with faded booths and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. Brian was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth, his fingers tapping anxiously against the table. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe, or the ghost of the love I wasn't sure still existed between us. I slid into the seat across from him, keeping my expression neutral. What's going on? I asked, not wanting to drag this out any longer than necessary. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face before looking at me. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice raw, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I swallowed the lump in my throat, keeping my tone even. Brian. No, let me finish, he cut me off, leaning forward slightly. I know I've been an ass. I know I've tried to control things instead of listening to you, and I know I made you feel like you had to choose between your career and our family, and that's not fair. You're an amazing mother, Amanda, and I should have supported you instead of making you feel like you weren't enough. I stared at him, my heart pounding, because these were the words I had needed to hear months ago, before everything had started to fall apart. Then why did you spend so much time making me feel like I wasn't? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Because I was scared. I was scared that if you kept pushing forward, if you kept climbing higher, one day you'd realize you didn't need me anymore. And instead of dealing with that, I tried to make you feel guilty for succeeding. I inhaled sharply, because as much as I had suspected it, hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much worse. That's not love, Brian, I whispered. That's control. He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. I know, he admitted, and for the first time in a long time, I saw real regret in his expression. I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I don't want to lose our family. Would you go to therapy with me? I had spent months imagining this conversation, waiting for him to finally acknowledge what he had done, but now that it was happening, I didn't know if I could believe it. Part of me wanted to say no, to walk away and never look back, but another part, the part that remembered who we had been before everything had gone so wrong, wasn't ready to let go just yet. Okay, I said finally, and for the first time in what felt like forever, something that almost resembled hope flickered between us. Therapy wasn't a magical solution. It was difficult and painful, and some days it felt like we were just picking at old wounds without actually healing them, but we kept showing up week after week, because for the first time in a long time we were both trying. And eventually we found a compromise, one that worked for both of us. We moved to a city closer to my office, somewhere that made sense for my career but still allowed Brian to continue his work. We hired a nanny, a woman named Lucia, who had raised 3 kids of her own and wasn't afraid to tell either of us when we were being ridiculous. And while our relationship was far from perfect, while there were still moments of tension and lingering resentment, we were both willing to work on it. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching Sophie play, Brian reached over and took my hand. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, and I wasn't sure if I believed him yet, but for the first time in a long time I wanted to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.